watching Business World Live. I'm Danny Laurel.
And I'm Jess De Los Santos. Here are the biggest stories to kickstart this trading day, Friday. As widely expected, the Bangko Sentral holds policy rates at record lows to support sustained economic recovery.
The Finance Department is now in talks with banks for its maiden green bond offer.
Philippine exports may have rebounded last year, but a UN body report says the country's total export performance continued to be a laggard in Asia-Pacific.
And Manila Water and the MWSS are deferring their new concession deal to March. We begin our broadcast with the Bangko Sentral keeping key rates unchanged. That's for a 10th straight meeting.
But the central bank says an eventual unwinding of policy may take place once recovery is sustained or inflation risks arise. The BSP maintained its overnight reverse repurchase rate at a record low of 2%. This had been unanimously expected by 16 analysts polled by Businessworld last week. Meanwhile, the overnight deposit rate was kept at 1.5%, while the lending rate wasn't changed at a historic low of 2.5%. Jokno said the Monetary Board deemed it prudent to maintain the accommodative stance given a manageable inflation environment and emerging uncertainty surrounding domestic and global growth prospects. The BSP says the domestic economy is seen to return to pre-pandemic levels by the third quarter of 2022. However, Jokno said elevated commodity prices as well as geopolitical tensions may cloud recovery prospects. Jokno said the increased volatility in global oil prices would warrant close monitoring and appropriate interventions should be implemented to avoid second-round effects. Now, given these considerations, the BSP has raised its inflation forecast to 3.7% this year. That's from a previous estimate of 3.4%. Meanwhile, the Finance Department is now in talks with banks for its planned $500 million green bond offering this year. The DOF says it is now discussing with various lenders the appropriate tenor or structure of the maiden ESG, or Environmental, Social, and Governance offering. Finance Secretary Sonny Dominguez says the department will release more details when the country is ready to move forward with the transaction. Funds raised from green bonds are used for climate mitigation and environmental projects. All right, then, the BSP held up as expected yesterday afternoon, but other issues are hounding markets these days. Give us the Friday open report.
All right, Jess. Well, stocks are opening a Friday morning on the back foot. That's actually extending a global sell-off that we've been seeing. This, of course, as investors are seeking or continuing to seek havens amid the security outlook in Eastern Europe. So that hasn't been totally resolved. And if so, that would be the second week of losses for global equities, and our index is no exception. You can see us sliding down to 7411. That's down by 0.4% this morning. And banks are clearly in focus here, of course, as the Bangko Sentral held its rate at a record low for a 10th straight meeting yesterday, but that was largely expected. Apart from that, a lot of other issues in terms of banks. Fitch, for instance, has affirmed its BBB rating for Philippines as long-term foreign currency, and S&P Global Rating says credit costs will probably continue to moderate. That's as most of the stressed loans have either been recognized or restructured, and you can see us, or at least the banks here, going up a touch, going against the current of red. Now, let's just take a quick peek at a couple of stocks that I wanted to watch today. One is Metro Pacific, that's down by 0.8%. But this, of course, I'll pull out the 3-day chart for you. This, as it pulls back from the highest that it touched in almost 9 months. And you could see that on my terminal here. If it does load, it's a little bit slower this morning. But yesterday, it did climb as much as 6%. That was the most in 9 months after the company said that its board approved a 5 billion peso stock buyback. Now, another thing that did happen recently is Indonesia's unit of MPIC started its toll road project. That's a $53 million project in Indonesia. They said that that is targeted for early completion rather in early 2023. And finally, just another stock, just Globe, that is down by 18 pesos, down by 0.7%. This, even as they did mention, they're seeing a huge potential in telehealth. So Globe, a telecom company now moving into health, they have a couple of apps. One is Consulta MD, that's virtual medical consultation. They said that that recorded 140% jump on revenues. User base is now over 1 million. And they have another app called Health Now, that is medicine delivery platform. They said they have 800,000 customers in 2 years, and they've already administered close to 1 million vaccines to date. And finally, quick check on our local unit. That is the peso strengthening a touch this morning, 51.318. This even as it has been Asia's worst performing currency so far this month.
Here are the other headlines we are keeping our eyes on. PEZA says its locators posted growth to $63 billion on their exports last year. PEZA Director General Charito Plaza said employment in registered economic zones rose by almost 14%. That's equivalent to over 100,000 new jobs in 2021. PEZA approved some 70 billion pesos worth of investments last year, which are projected to create around 35,000 direct jobs. The current roster of ecozones is at 415.
And this from the Philippine Star. The country's air travel saw further decline last year. This as passenger travel plummeted by 41% to 7.7 million in 2021. Now, domestic passenger traffic was also down 20% to 5.5 million last year, while international passenger traffic fell by 65% as tight border restrictions remained due to COVID-19. Now, while local airlines saw a slight recovery in the fourth quarter of last year, the Association of Asia Pacific Airlines believes that 2021 will be remembered as one of the most challenging years for the regional airline industry. The group added that for meaningful recovery to take place, border restrictions would need to be eased on a consistent basis and simplified for the travelers.
The Budget Department has released nearly 8 billion pesos worth of COVID-19 risk allowances. The DBM says almost 527,000 healthcare and non-healthcare workers involved in the COVID-19 response will be granted the allowance. 4.5 billion pesos is allocated for the DOH and public hospital workers. The remaining amount will be given to health workers assigned to LGUs and private health facilities. Each worker will receive a monthly benefit of 3,000, 6,000, or 9,000 pesos depending on the risk level of their jobs.
Manila Water has agreed to postpone the start of the new concession deal with the MWSS to March 18th of this year. The listed firm explained that this will give them more time to comply with the remaining condition under the revised concession agreement. Now recall that the revised deal includes a tariff freeze until the end of this year and the removal of the foreign currency differential adjustment. It also includes a tariff adjustment for inflation.
After the break, Philippine exports continue to be a laggard in the Asia-Pacific region.
More of that and other stories when Business World Live returns. Stay with us.
You're still watching Business World Live here on One News. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Dani Laurel. Now, a UN report showed that the Philippines' export performance remained lower compared with other Asia-Pacific economies leading the global trade economy.
That's despite the fact that local exports climbed by more than 14% in 2021. Philippines' export performance lagged behind Indonesia, China, Malaysia, and Singapore, but still ahead of Thailand and Japan. That's according to a report by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD. Now, the same report said global trade in goods and services will likely slow this year. That's after a strong showing in 2021. Overall, the value of global trade reached a record $28.5 trillion in 2021. That's 25% higher than the previous year and a 13% increase from the pre-pandemic level in 2019. Now, circling back to our top story on the central bank, already signaling a possible easing in its policy stance after keeping rates unchanged yet again. When does our guest expect the BSP to unwind? We have on the show Professor Ronilo Balbiran of the University of Asia and the Pacific. Good morning, Prof. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Jess. Happy
All right.
to be here.
Sir, for how long can the BSP afford to stay patient on its policy stance? When do we expect them to keep track of rate hikes seen, at least in the Bank of England, and then also the looming tightening from the Fed?
Certainly not within the first half of this year. With increased risk in inflation, they can consider hiking the policy rate by the next half of this year. But I'm positive that they have the elbow room to actually delay the rate hike all the way to the end of this year. Why? Because we need more growth than the control of inflation. And remember, in 2017, that already happened as well, no? When the Fed had several increases in their policy rate, but we maintained our rates and it did not affect our inflation. And so there's really that divergence between the policy action of the Fed and the BSP, whereas the Fed is driven by their historical increases in their inflation. However, our case is not a case of too much surge in demand, but we are still recovering. In fact, we will still hit the pre-pandemic level in the second half of this year, but we're just talking about recovering the losses from the 2020 negative 9.6% reduction in GDP. Meaning, we have not talked about recovering our foregone growth momentum over the last 5 to 10 years before the pandemic, which we were growing at 6.6%. So kung i-add pa natin yung 6.6% average growth rate every year, so we should be focusing on growing our economy at 8 to 9% every year if we are to shorten our recovery period and hitting our original momentum.
Okay, so Prof, you were mentioning about inflation earlier. Of course, the BSP also somehow hiking its forecast for the year, especially at the latter part of 2022. What risks are we seeing here? How much of a concern are oil pressures?
We have seen it that we have a diminished impact of oil prices on inflation. In fact, our inflation is really driven by two things. One is our supply chain bottlenecks, transport and logistics prices. And number two is actually the surge in demand. So I think the critical variable here is not so much about oil, but it's so much about what is happening in America right now, which we will encounter perhaps in the next 1.5 years. No, it's about the surge in demand and our supply chain not being able to actually follow that particular pathway in terms of supplying everything that we are buying.
Okay, sir, this is Danny jumping in. Let's talk about the global recovery here and how we are impacted. What are you seeing here? You already mentioned that we're gonna have to, grow by 8 to 9%, but we do see the rest of the world. You mentioned the U.S. They're already having inflation at 40-year highs. How will this affect our economy in terms of exports? There's a report that we're still a laggard in Asia Pacific. Is there going to be some sort of turnaround this year because of better global demand, for instance?
Well, our economy has been domestically driven, no? So it's our huge domestic demand that has been driving our economic growth. Now, our exports is always been a plus, no? Good to know because we have actually we have had troubles. Inspiring our export growth. No? So I'm not so worried about our export growth. But if and when our government and perhaps the next administration will be able to find a way to actually increase our promotion of exports, make sure that we have a favorable depreciated currency to inspire additional production of our export products, then we can actually close the gap in terms of trade. No? So and we can take advantage of the increasing demand in the global economy. Kasi we are a very very small player in this global trade, and so therefore we are not really affected by the swings in the demand of the global economy. So what's important for us from the point of view of exporters are actually cost driven. So transport and shipping
Okay.
costs, etc.
Okay,
Yeah.
so domestic issues, sir. But another thing that might be more important to our economy, perhaps not exports in particular, but remittances.
Yeah.
And that's the same global story. When there's more employment elsewhere, we tend to benefit it as a windfall, and that does drive consumption. We did see an all-time high in 2021, but actually the estimates were higher, at least for the last quarter, than what came out. How is this story going to change? Can we still rely on remittances to fuel consumption?
Yeah. Well, different from the story of the exports, our remittances are actually driven by the global demand. No? So global growth, and I'm positive that as we see the recoveries of nations, especially the U.S., the Europe, Japan. So we can expect higher remittances as we see more growth in the global shipping industry. So we have huge supply for maritime labor force. So we can expect that higher remittances will flow in to the Philippines as we experience higher global growth.
Okay, Prof, I want to pick up on one point you mentioned earlier. I mean, as expected, a number of economies, including you, I think, would expect us to return to pre-pandemic level by the latter half of 2022. But like what you mentioned earlier, we need to grow at least 8 to 9% in order for us to carry on that pre-pandemic momentum that we had. Question is, what's it going to take for us to get there, and when do you see that happening?
Well, if you just grow by 8%, it will take you 10 years to actually get back into the momentum path. I think that's what our dear NEDA secretary is talking about in terms of getting back on track for 10 years. So that's 8%. So if we want to shorten it, we have to grow by 9.5 to 10% so that we shorten it to 5 years. And if we want to shorten it for the next 3 to 4 years, let's grow at 11 to 12%. That's not impossible, but it will take a huge amount of effort from the public and the private sector in terms of making sure that our commerce is highly digital. Our government services are highly digital. The delivery of public services are highly digital. And most importantly, for example, the construction and infrastructure sector, which is the biggest multiplier of our economy, must actually transform into digital so that all these multiplier effects can actually have an impact to our economy at a much accelerated manner, and that will shorten our momentum story.
All right, of course, Prof, all of that hinges on who our next president will be. Of course, election just a few months away here. So far, we've heard a lot from the presidential bets, but who among them do you think has the most sound economic policy so far?
Well, we still have to listen to the economic policies. I think Isko Moreno has actually released its 10-point economic agenda. We have our Leni Robredo outlining the governance platforms. So I think it's from me. No, my bias is whoever gets to promote highly digital construction and infrastructure delivery, because that's the biggest multiplier to our economy. And so whoever gets to promise that they will build more, no, that they will build with highly digital technologies, then that will actually push everybody else into that growth. So I'm still, everybody promised that they will continue the Build program, but I'm still yet to hear from them in terms of the digital transformation of this Build program.
All right, safe answer there, Professor Balbiran. Thank you very much for your time this morning. Again, Professor Ronilo Balbiran from the University of Asia and the Pacific. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bilang Pilipino.
Presidential candidates continued to woo Filipino voters on Thursday. Gerard de la Peña gives us a recap of yesterday's campaign trail in this report.
The Lacson-Soto tandem is on the defensive after it received reports of a possible demolition job against their ticket. Lacson says supporters of another presidential candidate are making the plot after the aspirant felt alluded to in his Ubusin ang Magnanakaw campaign. Their camp has yet to verify the report, but says they remain undeterred.
Hindi naman kami titigil kasi I've been there, no? Na sabi ko 2001 hanggang 2010, yan naman talagang sanay na tayo sa bakbakan ganyan, yung black propaganda. So we'll still continue with that narrative. After all, yun naman talaga yung problema ng bansa natin.
Meanwhile, over at the Uni team, they get another endorsement, but this time only for Vice Presidential bet Davao City Mayor Sara Duterte. Ruling One Cebu party endorsed the presidential daughter, but made no mention if they're backing Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Manila Mayor Isko Moreno likewise made his way to the north as he visited La Union. But unlike the Uni team, which had multitudes of supporters in the region, the welcome for Moreno and his team was more lukewarm. But he remains hopeful that he can be an alternative for some Ilocanos.
I can be their alternative. Saka masaya na ako makakuha ng kaunting boto sa lugar na ito. Every vote, kumbaga, bawat boto mahalaga.
Over in southern Luzon, Senator Manny Pacquiao visited Montalban, Rizal. In line with his fight against corruption, Pacquiao bared that he plans on naming House Deputy Speaker Brother Eddie Villanueva as his corruption czar.
Gustong-gusto ko yun yung plano niya about sa pagsugpo ng korupsyon. Alam ko na ang lahat ng gagawin namin ay para sa Panginoon at para sa bayan.
And as for Vice President Leni Robredo, she went for arrest on Thursday and just met supporters online via live video. She also signed a covenant with persons with disabilities, vowing to involve them in crafting policies for the sector. For News 5, Gerard de la Peña, We Are One News.
The camp of presidential candidate Leni Robredo has launched a protest against COMELEC's recent move of taking down the campaign materials set up by volunteers in private properties. Robredo's spokesman, Barry Gutierrez, said the vice president was deeply concerned with what happened. Their camp is now mulling legal action against the poll body. Election lawyer Romulo Macalintal also insists that the COMELEC only has jurisdiction over election paraphernalia that are posted in public places. Robredo's camp says that people have the right to post whatever they want in their own private property, and the COMELEC has no right to enter anyone's property to take these down.
The campaign posters are the properties of the owners who posted them on their private properties. Therefore, the right to use the said property is protected by the said provision of the Constitution.
So what exactly are the do's and don'ts in terms of putting up campaign materials during the election period? Let's find out in this report by mobile journalist Yada Pascual.
Posters Signboards, tarpaulins, and even billboards. Campaign materials of candidates for the 2022 elections can be seen everywhere. But COMELEC reminds that there are requirements needed to be followed. Otherwise, it will be deemed illegal. COMELEC Resolution 10730 sets a strict sizing requirement for printed campaign materials. For example, pamphlets, leaflets, decals, or stickers cannot exceed the size of a bond paper. Likewise, size of posters made by cloth, paper, or carton should only be 2 by 5 feet. As for streamers, allowed sizing is 3 by 8 feet in public meetings or rallies. It also has to be removed within 24 hours. Meanwhile, signboards have to be 3 feet by 8 feet only. The resolution also states that the person or group who paid for the campaign materials and the name of the candidate should be included on the print regardless if it's free or a donation. Posting of campaign materials in public and private properties with no consent are also prohibited. Why then were campaign materials inside properties of volunteers removed during the kickoff of Oplan Baklas? This caused an outcry online. COMELEC clarifies size limits apply even on posters inside private properties, but people who denounce the COMELEC's actions says that the COMELEC resolution is not a law and that it violates the rights to freedom of speech and expression. Recall that in 2015, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the Diocese of Bacolod for putting up a tarpaulin against reproductive health law. The judges also said that COMELEC has no right to regulate the expression of private citizens. To those who want to file a complaint, the poll body says you are very much free to do so. Mobile Journal Yeda Pascual, We Are One News.
And we're just a few days into the campaign, Dan. Well, that's a first look into the business day this Friday, February 18, 2022. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danny Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News.